Hello all, welcome to Quantifiers. Now that the CAT is done and dusted, the next thing that the CAT aspirants generally look for is another management entrance test. And one of the important topic that comes across in various exams is related to the rhetoric and literary devices. So this particular class will be basically on the rhetoric and the literary devices. So before we move on to this, can somebody or anybody can just think about what do you understand when I say that the class is on rhetoric and literary devices? So what are your expectations? What do you feel that the rhetoric is basically? So rhetoric is generally, you can say, is the study of writing or speaking. In another word, I would say that it is an art. It's an art of effective or persuasive, be it writing or speaking for that matter. Especially when you're using the figures of speech. Okay, so it's a kind of an art of effective or persuasive writing or speaking with the exploitation of different figures of speech and other compositional techniques, but of this, yeah. So figures of speech, I'm sure that you must have done in yours during your school days. So this lecture will be a quick recap of it, and generally some of the exams like SNAP, sometimes NMAT, and another exams, they do ask you one or two questions based on figures of speech or the literary devices. So why does the rhetoric is there in your exam, or why the question setter gives you the questions based on rhetoric devices? That is because the rhetoric questions on the reading test assess how well you understand the choices that authors make in structure and developing the text. So how well you are able to understand the way that the author has presented his thoughts. Okay, so when you are able to understand these rhetoric and the literary devices or the figures of speech for that matter, you'll be able to understand how the author is structuring his thoughts. Okay, so that is the case. Let's get into the another aspect. Let me just move on to the next slide. Yeah. Yeah, so the main usage of rhetoric, that was my previous question. So the main usage of the rhetoric is basically it is a linguistic tool that employs a particular type of sentence structure. It gives a kind of a sound, okay, or a pattern of meaning in order to evoke a particular reaction from an audience. When I say, the seashells from a seashore, so sea, kind of a sound. Each rhetorical device is a distinct tool that can be used to construct an argument or make an existing argument more compelling. Okay, so that's again, it's a kind of a effective or a persuasive writing or speaking tool, I would rather say here. Let's get into next. Yeah, so types of rhetorical devices. So generally, in case, if we over 2000 years ago, I would say there was a famous Greek teacher. I hope you know by the name of scientist also, and I would say a person who kind of figure out this rhetorical devices. So Aristotle taught his students that there were basically three ways of convincing audience. So in case if you want to write something or you want to say something and you want to convince your audience, so they are generally the three ways of basic or ways of convincing your audience of something, or at least getting your audience to listen to what you have to say. And these three, according to him, were divided into appeals to ethics, which is generally your ethos, appeals to emotion, which is pathos, and appeals to logic, logos. That whenever you are writing something, you can gather the attention of the reader on the basis of the ethics, on the base of ethics, on the basis of the emotion. Sometimes you can appeal to them emotionally. Sometimes you can write something that has a logic in it, and so the reader or the listener will going to listen to you. So we're going to delve deeper into these three aspects. They're generally not being asked in the paper, but yeah, understanding of this will definitely going to enhance your understanding of the text for that matter. So let's understand what is ethos and what are pathos and what are logos. So ethos is basically, you can say, it's a kind of, you can write, let's say, sometimes called an appeal to ethics, then is used as a means of convincing an audience via the authority or credibility of the persuader, be it a notable or experienced figure in the field of even a popular celebrity. So ethos, I would say, it's basically a way of convincing your audience of your credibility as a writer. Okay, so when you're convincing the audience of your credibility as a writer, so it is basically about the credibility as a writer. Let me give you an example here. The example is going to suffice. For example, let's say if I'm a psychology professor and I'm writing an essay about, let's say, the psychology of eating disorder. So I'm a psychology professor and I'm writing an essay about the psychology of eating disorder. Then she, I would love to say, then I would have strong built-in ethos. Okay. Now, how I have a strong built-in ethos? Because I'm from the same profession. So I'm writing a paper on psychology of eating disorder, and I am a professor, I am a lecturer in psychology, right? So I have that, I owe that particular credibility with me, right? But if the same, if in case if I have to write something on a paper of, let's say, quantum physics, then I'm not gonna have the built-in ethos, because I may lose the credibility. I'm not a professor of physics, but I'm a professor of psychology, right? So ethos is basically, it's a way of convincing your audience of your credibility as a writer owing to your profession. Okay, so that is the case. So appeals to ethos are intended to establish a person's professional credibility or qualifications to make a particular argument. So anyhow, we're going to take it up deeper further also with the help of the examples. It will become all the more clear. For example, let's say, as a doctor, I am qualified to tell you that this course of treatment will likely generate the best results. So now when I'm writing this kind of a statement, and by the profession, I'm a doctor. So I have this built-in ethos with me, because by the credibility that I have, by the qualification that I own, I have this particular built-in ethos, right? Now, since let's say I have lived in the apartment community for over 20 years and have loved my time here, I've never once made complaint until now. Now here, the author has a credibility because he himself has stayed in that particular place for a comparatively very long period of a time, and he's giving us such a good feedback over the place. So he has that ethos. So whenever you are appealing on the basis of the credibility on account of your qualification or on account of your profession, so that means that you are writing to the audience by appealing to their ethos, right? I hope by this example, this particular thing is clear. Let's move on to the next, that is your pathos. Now, basically pathos is very simple, because most of the writing, in case if you're reading a fiction, novel and something, so it's basically, it applies to the emotion. So appeal, or the story or the narrative for that matter. So appeal to emotion is a way of convincing an audience of an argument by creating an emotional response to an impassioned plea or a convincing story. So it is basically, you would say in a very simple word, that pathos is the appeal to human emotions, right? So whenever you're writing something with an appeal to human emotions, as a writer, I would say your job is to make the audience feel connected with your topic. Okay, so this is where the emotions come place, and wherever the emotions are there, the pathos come into the pictures. Okay, so let's see with an help of an example again. So basically, the pathos is all about when you're writing to appeal the emotions of the audience, right? So, for example, let's read the second one. We're not going to get into Congress debate, or you can always read this particular example for your better understanding after pausing it. I'm so sorry, I'm being putting this rather than taking the draw. So, speeding cars are a huge danger to our children, our pets, and our community in general. That's why I'm proposing we install 10 speed bumps on 5 of our major streets. So when the author is making this particular thing, he's actually appealing to the emotions. He's saying danger, fear, children, love, your pets, your community, right? So whenever you're writing and that writing has an emotions involved in it, so that means that it is an appeal to your pathos, right? Let's get into the next and the last one, which is your logos. So what is in logos? So logos, it's derived from when you are appealing to your logic side. Okay, so that is the case. So appeals to logic is a way of persuading an audience with reason. So whenever you're writing something, but you're writing with the logic, there's a reason, there are the different facts and the figures that are used in it. So that means that you are writing with an appeal to logos. So appeals to logos are intended to speak directly to the audience sense of reason or logic. For example, let's say in the last 25 years, the city of Manuel has not had a single reported crime, making it the safest city in the world, right? So here you're giving them the reasons, you're giving them the logic. You're not appealing to the emotions, but you're writing with a fact. So that kind of the writing is basically an appeal to your logos. Okay, so with this three understanding, so why we need to know this particular thing is that to understand the style of writing of the author. So whether he's writing with the keeping into the consideration the ethos, the pathos, or the logos, the three terms which are sometimes asked in the paper also, and you should know that. Okay, now the next up in the row is the literary devices. So literary devices, yeah, they are generally on and off being asked in a lot of competitive exams, so you should know them. A literary device is a tool used by the writers to hint at larger themes, ideas, and meaning in a story piece of writing. Where I would literally say that a literary device is basically work along your writing, your plots, your characters to elevate a prompt reaction, okay? And sometimes on life or sometimes on, let's say, society, etc. So that is the case. So it is a tool which is used by writers to hint at larger themes or to prompt, to elevate, I would say, the prompt reflection for that matters, ideas and other. So that is the case. Okay, so literary device, that means that there is some other different meaning to it, or he's using a particular literary device to emphasize on something. So that is the case. You're not going to be asked in your paper what are literary devices, but yes, definitely you should know a couple of literary devices. Now, these are some of the literary devices that we're gonna discuss today. The very first is hyperbole or hyperbole, you say it generally. So, hyperbole is basically an exaggerated expressions, okay? So, an extravagant exaggeration, okay? So, that is basically your hyperbole or hyperbole. For example, I have called you 1,000 times yesterday, but you didn't answer the call. Now, I'm sure that the person might not have called 1,000 times, okay? So an exaggerated expression is basically your hyperbole. Now, sometimes when I say to my daughter generally that it's a mile-high ice cream, okay? You cannot reach to it because it's a mile-high ice cream. Now, what is this mile-high? Can ice cream be a mile-high? It cannot, but it is an exaggerated expressions of something. Okay, let's move to the next one. So I'll take it quickly, and you can always pause wherever you have doubts. You can always ping us, and we'll be more than happy to help you with more examples. Right? Irony. It's a one important thing. So this irony, sarcasm, satire might have troubled you a lot in your CAT tones based questions also. So what is an irony? It's basically three types of irony. I'll come to this later. Let's understand what the irony is. It's basically the use of words, okay, in such a way that express something other than, especially the opposite of the literary meaning. Okay, I'll give it a very simple. So that means that irony is basically the use of words to express something other than. So irony is basically the use of words to express something other than, and I would say especially the opposite of literally meaning. That is irony. Okay. So irony is what is intended is different from what is being coming out across as the first phase. Okay. I'll give an example from that. Irony is clear so far. Just remember that the irony is the opposite of the meaning that is written and the meaning that it is actually expressing. Okay. So the use of words to express something other than and spatially the opposite of literal meaning. Okay. For example, let's say my husband, my wife for that matter, okay, is flight attendant. So my wife is flight attendant, but she's terrified of heights. Is there an irony? Is there an irony in it? Can you figure out what is happening? So the wife is a flight attendant. So what is the purpose of the flight attendant? Is to stay in heights, okay? But what is the irony of the situation is that she is terrified of heights, okay? Let's say the another example, the police station got robbed. Now, what is the irony here? What is the purpose of the police station is to protect from theft and a robbery. And what is the irony that the police station itself got robbed? Okay. The marriage counselor files for divorce. Now, marriage counselor counsels people for staying in together in a marriage, and he or she himself or herself files for the divorce. Okay. And one of the famous irony is your that rhyme of ancient mariner. No, water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. So what is the irony of the situation? That I'm actually being surrounded by the water, but there's not a single drop to drink. And the irony is that I'm actually surrounded with the water, okay, but I cannot drink it. So that was a famous irony that you must have studied during your school days, right? So irony generally are of three types. There can be dramatic irony, situational irony, and a verbal irony. From a paper point of view, we generally will focus on a verbal irony, but yeah, you should definitely know all these three types of irony. So dramatic irony is when the reader or the audience knows about a particular situation or condition in the story or drama more explicitly than the characters playing them. Okay. So sometimes it happens that when you're watching any kind of a movie or a TV series or any your ODD series and all, okay? So you know beforehand the main characters, okay, this has already happened, okay, by the virtue of you being the audience. So that kind of a thing is dramatic irony, and the famous dramatic irony is your classic play of Romeo and Juliet, okay? So while the audience and the readers were aware of the fact that the Juliet wasn't dead actually, yet Juliet boyfriend Romeo did not know that, and finding her in a dead state, he killed himself. Okay, bringing the whole audience to the bewilderment, right? So this is a dramatic irony where the audience knows that the Juliet is still alive, okay, but the Romeo, the main protagonist for that, the protagonist for that matter, he himself does not know that the Juliet is alive, and he killed himself. So, okay, so this is a dramatic irony. Let's understand what is the situation irony. So situation irony is when you expect a different outcome of an event from the actual outcome. So you were expecting some different outcome, okay, but actually happened something else, okay. For example, a man carries an umbrella every day anticipating some rain, yet it never happens. So he carries the umbrella every single day, but the rain never happens. But the day he forgets to carry the umbrella, the rain happens, okay. So when you expect a different outcome of an event from the actual outcome, so you were expecting that it will be no rain and it rained, and there was an irony because I've been carrying the umbrella since so many days and it did not rain, and today I didn't carry my umbrella and it rained. Okay, so this is a situation irony. Let's understand the verbal irony, which is actually the crux of your competitive exam. So the verbal irony, I've already given you a lot of example. A marriage counselor files for divorce, the flight attendant is terrified of heights, okay, the police station got robbed, right? So verbal irony is whatever is said is exactly opposite to the intended idea, okay? So in Macbeth, when King Duncan said, I will rest in peace at your home to Macbeth. So what does he say? What does a king wants to imply? That he wants to take rest, he wants to sleep, okay? But what happened? What happened was actually the opposite. So when he was saying that I will rest in a peace, that wasn't the intended idea that he want to rest in peace, he want to die. But what actually happened? He was not aware that he would be murdered on the same night. So this is a verbal irony. So when whatever is said is exactly opposite to the intended idea. Okay. So that is the case. I hope with this the irony is clear. I've tried to give you a couple of examples so that it becomes all the more clear. And in fact, I'm gonna bring one point here. Your sarcasm. Okay, your sarcastic tone or your sarcasm is basically it's a rename, it's a paraphrase of a verbal irony. So it's a verbal irony is actually known as sarcasm. There's just a slight element in it that in a sarcasm there is a hint of mockery. Okay, so sometimes it happens no that you have not done your homework and your teacher is like, wow, you have done the entire homework, it's so brilliant. You know that whatever the teacher is intending to say, that is totally the opposite. Okay, so whatever she is saying is exactly opposite to the intended idea. The intended idea is to tell that you have not done your homework and it's a shame, but how she's saying, wow, you've done the entire homework. Okay, sometimes at our home the parents say, mama generally says no, wow, बहुत अच्छा काम किया, बहुत ही अच्छा काम किया. That means that is there is an element of mockery, and the whatever she is saying is exactly opposite to the intended idea, but there is a hint of mockery in it. So that becomes a sarcasm or sarcastic tone, right? I hope now the irony and a sarcasm is clear to you all, right? Now, next is anaphora. Now, anaphora is again a figure of speech. So, sometimes it happens, no? There is a repetited word or phrase at the beginning of a series of a sentence. For example, Martin Luther King, a very famous speech. I have a dream that one day this nation will. I have a dream that one day on the Red Hills. I have a dream that the little children. So, whenever there is a repeated word or phrase at the beginning of a series of sentence, then the figure of speech that is being used is anaphora. One such example I can give you is that we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow the ground. So we cannot. So that kind of a thing is anaphora, generally used by the author to emphasize upon something. Okay. I hope that's clear. Let's move on to the next figure of speech. Next is euphemism. So EU, in case if you have learned the words with the help of the root words, you know that the EU is a positive. And femism, euphemism. So what is this euphemism? It's a polite way of saying something harsh. Okay. So it is when the author deliberately chooses a milder term in place of a harsh term, right? For example, sometimes we say he died. So rather than saying he died, we are using a polite phrase, that is he passed away. Yeah, he's traveling to the heaven aboard. Okay. It happens sometimes that the HR fired something. So rather than saying that you are fired, we have to let you go. So ultimately, you are not more in the job. Okay. But a polite way of saying something harsh is your euphemism, a common term that is being used, and you is your positive root word. So euphony and all that. So makes sense. Let's get into the next. Okay. Simile. Now, what is simile? This is, I'm sure that you must have studied in your school days. So it's basically a comparison. So comparison of two unlike things that is generally used by, I would say comparing two unlike things that is often introduced by like or as. For example, she's as brave as lion. So what I'm doing, I'm comparing she to the lion, but in that, what I'm using is the words like as. So whenever I'm using as or like, for example, let's say as slow as sloth, right? So I'm comparing somebody, she is as cold as ice, okay? So I'm comparing her two unlikely things, but I'm using the words like this, okay? She's like flour. Okay, so I'm comparing her to flour by using the words like or as. So that kind of a figure of speech is known as simile. And when I introduce simile, the next has to be what? What do you guys feel? Okay, if you remember your school, yes, exactly. It has to be metaphor, right? Now, what is metaphor is that when two things are compared without the help of like or as. So what's the difference between simile and a metaphor is that with simile, again with a simile, there is a comparison. With metaphor, there is a comparison. But with simile, we use the words like or as. But with metaphor, we don't use, but there is a comparison. For example, she's the lioness of our family. Right? So she's being compared to the lioness, but I'm not using like or as. In case if I would have written as she is as fearful as lioness. Okay. Then in that case, that becomes simile, but here I'm not using like or as, so that becomes my metaphor. For example, we say, no, my mom has a heart of gold. Yeah. So we are comparing her heart to gold, but I'm not using again like or as for that matter, right? So I hope with this now the simile and the difference between the metaphor is clear. Next up in the row is a personification. This is again easy. It's a quick recall of whatever you have done. So personification is when an author gives human-like attributes to a non-living things. When you personify the non-living things, when you try to compare them as a human being. So that is personification. For example, the sea is breathing. Now the sea cannot breathe, but you are attributing the sea a human-like characters. The wind knocked on my door. Okay, wind knocked on my door. Okay, but you're attributing a human-like characters to a non-living thing, that is wind. So that is a figure of speech is personification, right? Let's get into the next one. Yeah, so the next is onomatopoeia. Now, what is an onomatopoeia? It's an interesting figure of speech. So, when the writer chooses to use a word that represents the very sound it associated with, or it stands for, sometimes they say chuk, 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 chuk. Now, what I'm doing, when I say chuk, 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 you know that this is the sound that is being made by the trains. Okay, so when the writer chooses to use a word that represents the very sound it is associated with, okay, for example, sizzlers. So why the name? Okay, because it's sizzles. Okay, clap. Now clap is your sound. Okay, so whenever the writer chooses to use a word that represents the very sound it is associated with, okay, so that way, so chuk chuk chuk, and in just few minutes, the whole train railway stations were deserted by all the people who were seen earlier hustling, bustling. Okay, so the words that basically express the sounds of the idea that the author wants to convey, then in that case, the figure of the speech is referred to as onomatopoeia. Let's get into the next one and let's see what is that. Okay, antithesis. Okay, thesis. Now what is your antithesis? When two contrasting phrases are put side by side to put emphasis on the context. Okay, now what is happening? There are two phrases: to err is human and to forgive is divine, right? Now here there are two contrasting ideas. Now what are the two contrasting ideas? To commit error is human and to forgive is divine. So these are two, to commit error and to forgive. Okay. So let me, sometimes no, in exams we used to say this thing, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Okay. Remember, hope for the best. For the CAT exam, we have been using this particular phrase. So hope for the best and prepare for the worst. So can you see the opposite two contrasting ideas? So what is the contrasting idea? Best and the worst. And they are put together in a phrase to emphasize on the context. Okay. Let's say it was the best of the time, it was the worst of the time. So opposite ideas. Right? I hope now this is clear. Anti itself stands for the opposite. So thesis is an idea. So opposite idea, this is how you can remember it also. Now oxymoron. Now what is oxymoron? Again, a very important figure of speech, I would say. So when two contrasting figure terms are put next to each other to make the term more thought-provoking or just to make it stand out. Okay. Now, don't get confused between antithesis and oxymoron. In oxymoron, there are two contrasting terms that are put next to each other. They were the two opposite phrases, okay? And in that phrases, there were two opposite words, so that becomes your antithesis. In oxymoron, there are two terms that are, for example, deafening silence, okay? So, what is this deafening silence? So, it's a kind of, I hope you are able to understand like what is oxymoron is. So two opposite ideas. For example, let's say suddenly the room filled with a deafening silence. Now, deaf and silence. Okay. And let's say the comedian was seriously funny. So funny and serious aren't the opposite ideas. Okay. So when two contrasting terms are put next to each other, so that means a oxymoron. Okay. Now, it's not a phrase. They are put together. For example, let's say you are clearly confused about by the situation you have put yourself in. Let's say, okay. So you are clearly confused by the situation you have put yourself in. So now this clearly is an opposite to confused, but they have been put together to make the term more thought-provoking or just to make it stand out. Alia Bhatt is pretty ugly. Okay. So got it? Pretty and ugly opposite. So opposite words placed together to each other to invoke a more emphasis on a particular words or a thought. In that case, that particular thing is figure of speech is referred to as oxymoron. Right? I hope you're not getting confused between the antithesis and oxymoron. Colloquialism is a very simple, it's a colloquial is your slang, your informal and a casual form of writing. Okay. So the use of slang, informal and a casual terms in writing. Writers prefer to use colloquialism to connect better with the targeted audience. So when I'm writing like your youth, Okay, so I'm appealing to the youth. So maybe I'm going to use a more of a colloquialism, the kind of the language that they use. I want to go there. I want to do there. Dude, hey dude, what's up? Hope you are ready to paint the city red. Okay, so kind of language that is regional. I would not say regional, but something which is slang, informal, and which is meant to target a particular audience. So this happens, no? Sometimes in the speeches, the politicians, they actually speak a local language, okay, vernacular language before starting their own lecture and all. They greet with a local vernacular salutation. So that kind of a thing, colloquialism, okay. Let's get into the next one. Okay, juxtaposition. Now, what is juxtaposition is when a writer puts two contrasting notions or ideas side by side. Okay, it's a kind of, you can say, antithesis. Okay, but antithesis, there is an opposite ideas to emphasize on something. So, for example, let's say it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. Okay, now this, it's again a kind of a repetition. So one of the figure of speech, what come across to your mind? Anaphora, okay? So it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. So wisdom and foolishness. So there are two contrasting notions of the ideas that are being put side by side. So that is juxtaposition. A very thin line between antithesis and juxtaposition, and I'm sure that they're not going to give you a much of juxtaposition and the antithesis in a one example on a one question options only to make, because this is slightly confusing. Okay, so that is the case. Yeah, okay. The world of lost and found, for example, right? So this is also an example of juxtaposition. So there's a difference. And that's what I was telling you. So maybe this can also goes for the antithesis. But when I say that the world of lost and found, this is only juxtaposition. Okay, because antithesis is an opposite phrases. Okay, and in phrases there are opposite words. So maybe yes, definitely this can be treated as an antithesis. It can also be your anaphora, where the repeated phrases are being used at the beginning of the sentence, and it can be a juxtaposition. But juxtaposition is generally, it's better explained by this example, the world of lost and found. So two contrasting notions or ideas are being placed side by side, and it's not oxymoron. Okay, oxymoron is altogether a different thing. That is pretty ugly. So there's no comma, there's no nothing, and it conveys a single meaning. Here it is not conveying a single meaning. The world of lost and found is altogether a different things. Okay, maybe let's say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Okay, so old dog, new tricks, opposite ideas. So that is a juxtaposition. They are being asked in your exams, so you should know them. Okay, next is light tease. Now, what is light tease? Is the use of double negative in writing. Okay, it's also called as double negation. So when I say I don't know nothing, ideally it is a grammatical error. I don't know anything. Okay, yeah, I know nothing. This should be the correct framing of the sentence. But sometimes, again, to emphasize on something, you are using a double negation. Okay, so I don't know nothing. So don't is a one negative term and a nothing is a negative term. Let me give you one more example of light tease. For example, the ice cream was not too bad. Right? So bad and not, rather than you can say that the ice cream was decent, it was okay, okay? But you're using two negative terms, double negative in writing. So that, to again to emphasize, that is the main purpose, though there's a particular intention whenever the author use the figure of speech in writing. Okay. Next is your malapropism. Now, what is a malapropism? It is a deliberate use of similar sounding words instead of an appropriate term to introduce humor in writing. Okay, now this is a similar sounding words. Okay, so similar sounding words, I hope you can always read this particular example. Yeah, so similar sounding words, what do you, can you think of any sort of an examples right now? No, so let's read this. A writer uses flamingo instead of flamenco. Here, the former is a kind of word and the latter is a dance type, right? So you are using a similar sounding word. So flamingo and flamenco almost sound similar, okay? And but you're using Flamingo, again flamingo because dancing, okay, rather than flamenco, it's an instead of an appropriate term to introduce humor in writing, right? Let me give you an example. Let's say he is, oh, sorry. Yeah. Let's say he is the very pineapple of politeness, right? So he's the very pineapple of politeness. Pineapple? Okay, it should be actually pinnacle. Okay, but rather than pinnacle, what you're writing is a pineapple. So you're using similar sounding words to evoke a humor in your writing. That is a malapropism. Okay, so this is similar sounding words. But when you have, look, there is one more figure of speech. I think so. I've not kept it here. Alliteration. Now, what is an alliteration? Is the use of same letter or sound at the beginning of the words. Okay. For example, let's say, no, I said that seashell in the sea shore, no, something like that. Okay. So that is a case alliteration. So it's involved two or words that appear closer together and have the same initial consonant sounds is basically an alliteration. Red roses, okay. Good grief, so GG sound. So that is alliteration. So don't get confused between malapropism and alliteration. Let's get into next. Paradox. Again, a very important figure of speech. So paradox is when an author uses a complex idea which at first looks, I always kept on picking up this particular thing. Okay, so when an author uses a complex idea which at first looks very confusing, but at close observation makes sense. Okay, for example, you can save money by spending it. So very in simple word, a paradox basically again refers to a contradiction, right? So when I say you can save money by spending it, what is a contradiction? Save and spend, okay? But is it practically possible? Can you save money by spending it? So what is the paradox that at one go, there looks, what a bakwas sentence, okay? How can save and spending can come together? But in case if you go deeper, okay, you'll be able to understand that the sentence has a particular meaning to it. So you can save money by spending it. Yes, by investing, right? For example, let's say this is the beginning of the end. So this is the beginning of the end. Now, what is the opposite ideas? What are the contradiction? Beginning and end, right? But deep down, is there any meaning? So maybe let's say this wars that are going on right now, this is the beginning of the end of the world or something, okay? Or the climatic disasters or the catastrophic things that are happening. So this is the beginning of the end, okay? The humanity or the mankind may not survive maybe a few years down the line. We hope that this never happens, but yeah, just an example of paradox, okay? So I hope the paradox is clear to you when there are two complex ideas which at first looks confusing. It looks a kind of a contradictory, but at close observation, it makes sense to you. That is basically your paradox, okay? Next is synecdoche. Now, what is synecdoche is that when a writer uses a part of a whole to represent the whole, sometimes it happens, no? We are referring to crown. Let me give you an easy example, okay? So we are using an example of crown. Now here the crown does not refers to that jewelry piece, okay? But the crown here refers to the people who are ruling, okay? So when a writer uses a part of a whole, so this crown is a part of a king or a queen, okay? To represent the whole. But now here the crown is representing the ruling people, or it is referring to the kings and a queen. So it's a part of it, but it is referring to the whole, okay? So that is the case. For example, hired hands. Now, hired hands is generally referred to the workers. Now, hired hands are the part of the workers, right? But they are, again, now when your author are using and he's talking about hired hands, so he's referring to the workers. He's referring to the whole, right? Next, you can take one more easy example is, yeah. So in case if your parents buy you a car and you say that you just got a new set of wheels. Now, wheels is a part of car, but when you're telling your friends that you have got a new set of wheels, so that means that here it is referring to the whole, that is your car, okay? Sometimes, no, suits. So suits basically refers to the business class. Okay. So that is the case, but this is a part of your business class. So that is the case. I hope now synecdoche is clear to you. Next is satire. So satire is again a very important form of writing. Okay. It's again, you would say that it is when a writer uses humor to highlight some aspect of human nature or society. Okay. It is usually achieved with the help of exaggeration, ridicule, or irony. So sarcasm, irony, satire, sometimes they overlap. Okay. So the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, ridicule, okay, to, I would say, basically to expose or criticize, okay, people's stupidity, people's vices, okay, particularly in the context of politics and the other tropical issues, okay. So that is satire. So when you use all these things, humor, exaggeration, ridicule, irony, okay, with the main purpose to expose or criticize some bad follies, some stupidity, some vices. So that means that what you're using is a satire, okay. And one classic read to understand the satire is your Animal Farm by George Orwell. Okay. So it's a satire on a political system and inequality in the society. I've got a picture on the next slide. So that kind of a generally, so sorry, jo aaj tak pe they see. So this is kind of a satire. Okay. So where you're making an exaggerated version, but you're conveying some kind of a meaning to it. Okay. There's a humor, there is an irony, there is an exaggeration, there is a mockery. Okay, to criticize people's vices, stupidity, okay? So that is a case, right? I hope now with this image, the satire element is clear to you all. Now, the last one, or maybe there is one more, one or two, is your metonymy. Now, metonymy is a figure of speech, and it needs not be confused with synecdoche. Let's understand what is metonymy. It's not to be confused with synecdoche, a term that represents or serve as a synonym for some things or things. Okay, the term is usually not directly related to the thing it represents. Okay, for example, we say pen is mightier than the sword. So when I say that the pen is mightier than the sword, so here does not actually the pen does not refer to the pen that is used for writing, and the sword does not refers to the weapon. There is another meaning to it. Okay, so the pen here represents the power of knowledge and books and intellect, and the sword represents the violence of war. Okay, so when a term, now synecdoche was a part representing the whole. Okay, so this is particularly a part. Okay, for example, crown, that was a part of the king or queen, and that is representing to the kings and a queen. Okay, now here when I say pen is mightier than the sword, yes, you can say that the pen is a tool or it's a part of the writer, but here the idea is something deeper. So it's a term that represents or serves as a synonym for something or things. The term is not usually directly related to the thing that it represents. Okay, so pen to the power of knowledge, sword to the violence or a war. Okay, but may not be a tool. So here the sword does not refers to, let's say, the people who fight or the pugnacious or the belligerent people, but the sword here refers to the violence or war for that matter, right? So that is the case. So by this, we are almost done with our figures of speech. I hope that you're gonna have some learning from this lecture, okay? And in case if there are still some doubts or the confusions, always please ping us. We'll be more than happy to help you with it. So happy learning, stay safe and work hard, and all the best for your exams. Thank you guys.